Grant Robertson.
Is the member for problems? I'll certainly give him that, the Minister who's just sat down. Mr Speaker, in a government that is increasingly in disarray, we've reached peak chaos when it comes to housing. Because that's what's happened on that side of the House. No matter how much Nick Smith can get up and bluster away about what he thinks he's done, every other commentator in New Zealand recognises that this government's housing policy is a failure. Every other commentator recognises that except for Nick Smith. And it's all very well to come to the House with this bill, which is a meek and pathetic and pitiful attempt to do something about housing. But to actually address housing, the government needs to think about actually addressing both sides of the housing equation. Now, there's some members on the other side of the House who perhaps have been a little surprised at me becoming the finance spokesperson. But here is a message for those members. Here is a message for those members. It's a pretty basic one. If a market's going to work, you have supply and demand. And unfortunately, when it comes to the National Party, they think they can put up demand measures and not address supply. And as Phil Twyford said at the start of this, Nick Smith says they're building record numbers of houses. Dr Smith, you're not. You're not building record number of houses. You're building half the number of houses that Labor was building in the peak of our time in office. And the fact is, if Dr Smith wants to compare building of houses during the global financial crisis and building of houses today, well, he can come up with his mythical statistic of doubling the number of builds. But in reality, there has been a complete failure by the government to build houses. Dr Smith himself has admitted it. We've got an 18,000 home gap that's been built up in terms of what's needed in Auckland. You need to be building 13,000 homes just to stand still a year. 18,000 built up. There is a crisis, Dr Smith. It doesn't matter how often you want to walk away from it. Housing is now completely unaffordable for a large number of New Zealanders, and the kind of tinkering measure that is present in this bill does very, very little to address those issues. You know, New Zealanders for many generations have thought that owning a house was the kind of thing that was part of when you got a good job and you were well paid, you would be able to own a home. Well, unfortunately at the moment, it costs 63.1% of one median income to pay the mortgage on a median price house. That's up from 55% just 5 years ago. If you're in Auckland, it costs 88%. 88% of one median income to pay the mortgage on a median house, up from 70.4% 5 years ago, up 18% in just those 5 years. And so coming up with a scheme that might give somebody an extra couple of $1,000s or a couple, maybe an extra $5,000 does not bridge the gap, Dr Smith. It doesn't do it. This is a pitiful response. Because when you've got the average price of on a house in Auckland at $748,955, that's just up 3.1% in the last 3 months. And as Andrew Little said the other day, the average house price in Auckland earns more in the last year than the average worker did. It's out of control, and all the government can do is come along and tinker and add on to the KiwiSaver policy in a way that is in fact greatly exaggerated. And I do want to pick up something that Nick Smith has just said, because he's claimed the additional number of people benefiting from this proposal at 90,000 people, an impressive sounding number, Dr Smith, except for the fact that 50,000 of them were going to get it anyway. No change. No, that's what the Treasury have said. 50,000 of those people were already going to get it. So actually the number that's claimed is around 41,000. Except the chaos of this policy continues, because when National tries to work out its costings, it says it's going to cost $218 million. But that's for the 41,000. So if it's 90,000, Dr Smith, then the cost would actually be $435 million. So they can't even get their numbers straight on this policy, let alone whether or not it will actually have any great impact. Mr Speaker, it's quite clear, as Phil Twyford has already said, if a demand is going to increase in a supply-constrained environment, this policy is not going to work. And Gross supply, Dr. Smith said. Exactly the point. And how many houses they built? The Great Housing Accord that's built 5 houses. 24,000 he's now claiming. Plucking a number completely out of the air. And Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the UK Conservative government has actually come out just in the last few days and said, and this is the exact quote from Danny Alexander, to the private sector, if you don't build houses, we will. That's what the UK government's now saying, because they've recognised, a Conservative-led government, they've recognised that actually, yeah, they've had a look at KiwiBuild, it'll be called Corgi Build or something of that nature if it goes on in the UK. They've recognised the need to make sure that the state is actually there where the market is failing. And that is Dr. Smith's problem. He's not prepared to use the fact that the government can build these houses. And KiwiBuild was a popular policy, and some of the backbench members over there were shouting out about the fact that 25%. The reality is, look at any survey of that policy. New Zealanders understand that if we are going to ensure that people have the ability to buy an affordable home, there needs to be direct intervention from the government to do so. But this government isn't prepared to do that. It only wants to sit back and try and let a market that has already failed fail even more. And that's the situation we find ourselves in today, Mr. Speaker, when we look at this bill that is in front of us here. We have a situation in New Zealand where home ownership rates are the worst that they have been in 60 years. We've got a situation where housing costs are outstripping and growing faster than income by far, and it is getting worse under the watch of this government. Everything that this government touches with housing is too little and too late. And that's what we see in this bill, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we look in, and Nick Smith raised the question, well, why is something wrong when Labor brought it in as a subsidy scheme, and why is it wrong, now wrong to extend it? The problem is the situation of supply. If Dr. Smith cannot come forward to this House with realistic initiatives that will create more than just a handful of houses around Auckland, he keeps claiming 24,000, that's not what the government created. That was happening anyway. The big new initiatives, 5 houses. The big new initiative, 5 houses, with the massive number of 18 by the end of the year. There's going to be a spurt in the last couple of months and he'll get himself to 18 houses. It is pathetic, Mr. Speaker. So in terms of this particular bill, the Labor Party looks at it like this. If the government really wanted to ensure that it was supporting first home buyers, it would focus on the building of affordable homes. And by saying in this particular proposal that they wanted to focus on new builds, there somehow is a belief in the government that new builds will be in the affordable housing area. Well, the evidence out there is that that simply isn't true and isn't credible. Because for developers, the money is not made in the affordable housing sector. We know that. That's the history of what's happened over the last few years. That's why we don't have affordable homes. So simply saying in a blanket way the notion that there will, because it's new builds, that somehow will translate to affordable homes isn't accurate. If the government wants affordable homes built, take the lesson from what's happening in the UK and get in there and muck in and help out in the sector instead of standing back and trying to use instruments that actually aren't going to work. This may well benefit 1 or 2 people. Well, that's good, to a small extent. It is not 90,000, Dr. Smith, we've established that. If it's 41,000, you'll be lucky. The problem is, whichever number it is a drop in the bucket. What is needed, Mr. Speaker, is housing policy that addresses supply and demand, and supply in terms of affordable housing. That will only happen if the government plays a more active role. If it carries on the way it's going, the crisis will deepen and more young New Zealanders will miss out on the opportunity of buying their own home.